Hi, this is Erica Norton, and I am the founder of Perfect Legal Video. I'm very excited to have with us today Attorney Nicole Reeves Lavallee. She owns a family and real estate law firm in the Worcester area. She and her team are just fantastic, and we're always excited to have them on the show. And so today we're actually going to talk about something super important and interesting. It's going to be about how temporary orders will affect your case all the way throughout to the end. And I want to welcome you to the show today, Nicole.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So, for those that are just getting into this exciting world of family law, uh, maybe through a new case or thinking about it, let's talk about what temporary orders are because that's something that happens in the beginning usually.
It is. It's usually the first time you go into court, whether it be a divorce case or a custody case or a paternity case. It's going to be the first time you go into court. It's going to be called a temporary order. It sets the tone for the entire case. So it really wants to involve lots of issues. So we're going to deal with health insurance, and we're going to deal with custody, and we're going to deal with a parenting schedule, and we're going to deal with child support. We're going to deal with division of some assets, maybe depending on what type of case it is, and maybe we're going to deal with who's going to live in the marital home, if there is one. So there's a lot of things that are going to be covered there, and maybe we'll even deal with extracurriculars. And that sets the tone for the entire case because we're going to work off of that. We may change it, but until we do, that's the order that stays in place.
Oh my gosh, that seems like so much. And I remember that it is so much, especially it's like drinking through a fire hose because you're just going to court for the first time. You might not even know yet how much the other person is bringing into the household. There's a lot of secrets that come out during that whole process. So, for them to start determining some of this, I mean, we talk about the financial side. Um, what I know there's the financial documents that you request and there's a certain like worksheet that you give to your clients. Do you want to talk about that a little bit as a precursor to the rest of the topic?
Certainly. So, obviously, the financial statement is going to be something that you're signing under the pains and penalties of perjury. And it needs to be true and accurate. You need to list all of your income, assets, and liabilities, as does your ex. The problem is you either don't know what your ex makes or you don't have the proof when we're in the courtroom saying he's lying on his financial statement. What do you do? Unfortunately, at that first hearing, if you don't have the proof, you suck it up and you do the orders and the child support guidelines based off of what's presented. So ideally, you have that information and you're sharing it with me, and I'm bringing it into court so I can go, Judge, he's saying that he only makes $52,000 a year, but if you take a look at his W-2 from last year, you can see he made $80,000. So we should do the average based off of that because he's still at the same job. There's no reason that his income decreased. Let him tell the judge why it did decrease. Maybe we have a pay stub that shows, look, I have a pay stub. It's a recent pay stub. It shows exactly how much he's making. So if we can have those are great. But obviously, this is the document that we're going to have to live with. And the judge will tell you right then and there, counsel, we have to live with these documents. We have to believe that they're true and accurate today because they're signing it under the pains and penalties of perjury. If you find out that that information is not accurate, feel free to come back. So without that information, we're kind of dead in water and we have to do what we have to do. So that's why it's so important for you as the other party to get as much information as you can to really show that they're being untruthful.
Uh, because at this point, there's a lot I mean, all the discovery isn't done yet. Is that right? I mean, the discovery is when you can get those bank statements and pay stubs and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that can happen as quickly as 10 to 15 days after somebody's served. So this is immediate. I mean, it could be 45, 60 days later, but chances are, as soon as you file, you're having them served. As soon as they're served, you're handing them temporary orders. So it could be just that quick, where within 2 weeks, you have that information. So if you're not living in the same household, or you don't have access to those records, or you don't have a CPA that you can call, a lot of times you are a fish out of water and you really don't have a choice on the matter. But that's why the judge gives you the opportunity to go counsel if and when.
And you better hope that your spouse isn't self-employed because then things get really hairy.
It definitely makes it a lot harder when you're in that situation, because there is going to be no pay stubs. Most likely there is going to be no, W-2s, or if there is, it's going to be an underreported W-2, and you really have to look at the whole tax returns to see what the schedules show. So it becomes a lot more involved anytime you're dealing with a self-employed person.
So is it true that when they're putting the temporary orders in, let's say for parenting time, they just do 50-50? Is that is that typically how they start? Or do they actually look at like one parent who's home more than the other? Or like how is that determined?
Oh, $1 million question. So they're most likely going to start with the parties having joint legal custody. But what you're talking about is that parenting schedule, which is physical custody. And that's a little bit harder because we're going to have to look at individual cases. Well, when did the parties last live together, counselor? 5 years ago. Okay, well, what has the parenting schedule been? And they're probably going to follow that parenting schedule. Versus, hey, they just moved out of the house last week. Well, okay, there was no parenting schedule. This is brand new. So, of course, the court is going to start with the premise of why shouldn't it be 50-50? So, they're going to take a look at it on a case by case basis, and they're going to look at the history. We have a child that is 2 months old. Obviously, there is no history, but we're also going to look at, is mom breastfeeding? Is it something that we can make sure we have bonding time? So, yes, that person's going to see the child every day, which is very disruptive, but we have to do it because we need to breastfeed and we need to have bonding.
I mean, yeah, so that definitely makes it very interesting. There's a lot to consider when it comes to parenting time. Another thing that people really worry about is healthcare because healthcare is very expensive, and if you're going through a separation, um, one of the spouses may make a lot less than the other. Maybe one's doing most of the caretaking of the children, and the other one's doing most of the work, which a lot of cases does happen. What do you do with the health care for the spouses and the children?
Well, that's the easiest question you could ask me, because the answer is we're going to keep everything the same. Everything is going to stay status quo, whether it's a divorce case or paternity case or custody case. Whoever has health insurance is going to keep health insurance. Whoever has health insurance for the children is going to keep health insurance. Same thing for dental and vision. Now, the real question is, the child's 2 months old and nobody's done it. Now what happens? That's really where it gets a little dicey, and we have to figure it out and we have to do an analysis. But generally speaking, that parent's going to be able to stay on their spouse's health insurance, and the child's going to stay. So that's nice. In a paternity case, obviously they were never on the same health insurance plan, but the child would stay on that plan.
I mean, that's got to be a relief for people that are starting to go through this process and they really have a lot of uncertainty in their life. I mean, at least healthcare is taken care of.
Good things, at least there's some good things about it, yes.
Now, I know that one of the other things that's a real concern is where is everybody going to live now? I mean, I hear nightmare stories about people that are still living with their ex-spouses for years while they're going through their very long divorce because they just can't afford another, because that's another whole serious whole set of bills to have another whole household with, all new utility bills and a new rent possibly, and um it's a lot for some people to take on and they just can't afford it.
Yes, and that's a huge thing. And that's the reason why, again, we're going to look at that child support provision, or maybe even an alimony provision, just to see what is going on and how we can support that household. But that's probably the hardest thing that my clients have to deal with, because they have to figure out, well, I can't afford to move out. I can't afford to keep the house. but I can't sell it and I can't move out. And I don't want the other person there. And that's another problem because you may not get the other person out of the house. You may have to coexist there for a period of time because there's a high standard for the person to vacate the home. So that is a lot of different factors. That's definitely on a case by case basis, looking at the facts. Is there a way that we can go, okay, we're going to pay you, $5,000 for you to have first, last, and security elsewhere? Because you're not going to be able to afford the place. Is there something else we can do? And that's really what it boils down to is as attorneys, we have to be creative. We have to give our clients lots of different ideas and hopefully one of them works for them in their particular case.
I mean, that's very interesting, and I've actually even heard advice for both men and women. I mean, depending on who it behooves to do this, but just seriously, don't move out of the house until you know that you have financing secured, that you can afford it. Don't just go move in with your mom or, try to find a place that you can barely afford. Because if you leave the house, you may not be getting back in there. I mean, is that true?
That is a very good premise. I mean, the reality is you're most likely not going to be able to get back in the house. There's occasions that you can, because, you move out and you say, I'm going to live with my mom, and your husband says, I don't want the house. The kids are better off here. Bring them back here. This is their home. So sometimes you do have reasonable spouses. Sometimes it's like, the spouse goes, I can't afford to live here myself either. So, oh my God. And you're going, well, if you're going to move out, I'm going to move back in. So there are certain circumstances, and sometimes we wait until the 11th hour and, who's going to refinance? Who's going to be able to buy somebody out? And all of a sudden, thankfully, Aunt Sally passed away and left you money. So, you have the ability to do that. So a lot of circumstances change, but generally speaking, once you move out, you're not moving back in.
Yeah. So stay put. It's hard too because you're going through a breakup and that's the last person you want to see every day, probably. And you're trying to explain things to the kids and it can be very difficult. So what else haven't we covered? There's so many there's so many pieces to the puzzle here. What else would you like to talk about when it comes to temporary orders? Oh, I guess a question I had, we still have a few more sections to go through, is just if they get something wrong, how hard is it to change before the end of the case?
Great question. I guess the question is what needs to change? Obviously, we talked about if it's a child support number and you come back and you really can show that the income was underreported or was inaccurate, can we change it during the pendency of it? Yes. We technically need to show that there's an emergency situation. The emergency is that you lied. You don't get to lie and get rewarded. So that's one thing. Obviously, if we're changing the parenting schedule, maybe we're doing really good and then something happens and DCF is involved and says, hey, Sally was beaten by dad. Okay, well, dad can't have parenting time right now. So that would be an emergency where we can come in and we can make changes to that. Certain things such as holidays. Okay, we're coming into the Christmas season. We did the temporary orders in January. We never thought we were still going to be here in December. Oh my God. That's a reason to come back in so we can make sure that the holiday schedule is what you want. So those are kind of the big ones of when we're going to be able to do it. The real question is when can we do it when we just don't like the temporary orders we agreed to? That's a lot harder. And the reality is, you might not be able to. You may have to live with those temporary orders, and those temporary orders may very well become permanent orders for the rest of your life. So you really got to make sure that the temporary orders are something that you can live with, and that's the absolute, I guess, maximum you're willing to do at that moment. Because your spouse or whoever else isn't going to settle for less all of a sudden unless they can show that we have DCF involved or something else going on. Why would they take less? So it really kind of sets a precedent from everybody's perspective is this is the order. We're starting here. We're not giving less. We may give more.
Ugh, it's hard. And it must be disheartening for some of your clients when they don't feel like they have either enough to live on or they're living in the right place or that they're seeing their kids enough. I mean, there's a lot to adjust to as it is with changing that relationship that, has a major point in your life. But then, there's so many facets that just have to do with just getting by every day and where and why and how. It's amazing. Um, what about daycare?
Well, daycare is going to again be determined by the child support guidelines. So at the time that we're setting in the child support guidelines, we're factoring in who's paying for daycare. So we'll make that as a temporary order initially, and that will carry through again until either final judgment or until one of your parties are changing, or obviously we age out.
And that makes a lot of sense. Um, there are some roadblocks that may come up though that people don't consider or immediately they're concerned because maybe their spouse has a drinking or a drug problem and that person is usually with the kids, so it's not as big of a deal, but now you've got the other spouse, they're going to have them 50% of the time, they're going to be driving around. um what happens when when you're concerned about that sort of thing? Do you have to wait till you can prove that? What typically happens?
Another really good question. It really kind of depends on the circumstances. Is that person going to admit it? Is there DCF involvement where we know it happened? Is there criminal record? So obviously all of those things are really easy. Is there a text message? um, do we have videos? There's lots of ways that we can prove these things. If somebody's saying no, I don't have a problem, then from our perspective the court's going to go, but what's the issue? And you're going to be able to have to articulate, like, yeah, he has a drinking problem, this is what happens, this is, he gets blacked out drunk. It happens every single Friday and Saturday night because he goes out and plays pool. And comes back from the bar and it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Like, this is happening every week, Your Honor. I see this. Obviously, the more you can articulate, the more the judge is going to go, maybe if nothing else, we put precautions in place. So, sir, are you going to agree that, you will not smoke or do any drugs or any marijuana or alcohol at least 24 hours in advance? Yeah, I'll do that. And so again, ma'am, would that satisfy you? Well, maybe. And so you really kind of go back to, is this the right thing? So that's going to be one of the things that the court's going to offer. There's other courts that are going to go, no, not happening, not a chance in hell. But it really depends on the judge. And I'm going to start with, generally speaking, we're going to give you, you're going to refrain from any use of whatever, at least 48 hours or whatever before. Obviously, if we have more proof, we're going to ask for sober link testing or other types of testing. We may have random alcohol and drug screens through the courthouse. So there's a lot of ways that we can facilitate to ensure that the child is safe once we acknowledge in some fashion that there is a problem. Now, obviously, if somebody's just crying wolf and saying, well, he has this issue and we can't prove it, unfortunately, sometimes I have to go, you have to wait until we can prove it. But I can't. Oh my God, well, how are you going to let my child be in this situation? Because I don't have the proof. There's no proof, and it's your word against his word, and the judge is completely buying everything he's saying. So sometimes I really do have to give that bad news of wait and see, hope. And it's really hard from the client's perspective, and I really hate doing that, but it's not my fault. It's the system's fault, and again, what we can prove.
And and that's always tricky. And here's something that's even trickier. Um, and we may not have even have time for this today, but I mean, what happens if, yeah, I mean, they tell you when you're going through a divorce, don't make any major purchases, don't get into a serious relationship, don't do anything different. Just try to keep on keeping along and keep your head down, get stuff done, and don't do crazy stuff. And so a lot of people don't do that, and they'll go and they'll jump into a new relationship. But sometimes that other person who is now spending time with your kid, they may have problems. And I mean, I just found out this last weekend that somebody that I know from high school's kid was is in jail right now for killing his girlfriend's 3-year-old daughter. And they don't know. I mean, it's not proven or anything, but there's a lot of evidence, and they were both into drugs, and it was a really bad situation. But apparently he just lost his temper, or someone did. It could have been the mom too. Um, but someone lost their temper, and they just the kid ended up dying, just being beat to death. And terrible, terrible situation. And you hope that that's not a normal, like that doesn't happen all the time. That's hopefully one of the things that doesn't happen too often. But I mean, it's out there, and they could be verbally abused too. Um, there could be more minor physical abuse. I mean, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really bad situation. I think, again, the good thing is the judge is running both parties' queries. So if you say, hey, look, you know, all of a sudden he brought this new girl in the relationship, and my kid is acting up, and my kid is saying that all they're doing is fighting, and she's living in the home now. Sometimes the judge will go, sir, what's your girlfriend's name? Fill out a query for her. And so they'll say, give me her date of birth and give me her social security number. And they'll actually run it to see if this person has a record. Now, obviously, in your particular case, maybe this person really did lose it and this was his first criminal offense, really, really bad criminal offense. But maybe he also had a history. And if he had a history, and if, the court had taken the time to do that, they might have said, oh no. I had a situation where grandpa was coming to visit, and he had a criminal record, and he was a nasty human being, and even dad didn't like him. But now all of a sudden dad's letting this child next to him, and grandpa starts pulling knives on people. And well, it's only a temporary situation. He was just visiting. Why are we putting the child in that situation? So again, there's a lot of times where the court's going to look at, is it a temporary thing? Is it, we're just visiting for Christmas, not that it makes it better, or is it, hey, we're living in the household and this is what we're dealing with? Because we've had that situation where sometimes it's just a roommate, and the roommate is explosive and volatile, and it doesn't have to be sexual in nature, just a roommate, whether it's same sex or different. But you still have this person in your household that's not treating your children fairly. So the good thing is the court can intervene and say, who is this person? And let's run their query and let's find out information about them. So there's a lot of ways that we can at least get that information. Is it foolproof? No, because again, you might have somebody that's perfect and a saint on paper and was never caught and never arrested, and now they go and do something horrible. But at least it's somebody putting eyes on them. Obviously, if the court really feels like something's going on, the court can call DCF and have an investigation done. So it really depends on what you can convey to the judge and how believable that is.
Yep, people are just unpredictable. And it just takes that one little chance for some of these people, and you don't know them that well. But I mean, I can see where people might be like your example of having a roommate because they can't afford everything and they need the help with the bills, but then they have children. So it's definitely very tricky. At least the court has a process in place to help handle these situations.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key point is, there's always, they've seen it all. Unfortunately, they've seen it all. They've heard it all. They've witnessed the abuse. They've witnessed the lies. And the court's thing is to figure out who's telling the truth and who's lying and who's crying wolf and all those good things. So again, a lot of times they will err on the side of caution to at least investigate it. Whether it amounts to anything, your guess is as good as mine.
And I do think that's interesting because I know, as a client of yours, when I first sat down with you and explained the situation that I was going through, and the reasons for the breakup, and like what we needed to do, what I did know, what I didn't know, that sort of thing. I mean, you really were able to, you could tell, like, well, if you do this, this will happen. If you do that, I think this might happen. I mean, there were options, and then there were the consequences of each option, and then there was like sitting down to figure out, well, what's the outcome that we're looking for, and which strategy is going to help get us as close, because nobody's completely happy, but getting as close to what you can live with as possible. And you don't even have all the information in the beginning, so you're really doing a lot more guesswork. But it was very surprising how close you came to telling me, like, what was probably gonna happen in the future, and what we could possibly, have as an arrangement in, all of those different areas of life. Because you see it every single day. I mean, how many times you go to court a year, like, for example?
I have been around the block once or twice. Um, on average, I'm there in court 3 times a week for the last 20 plus years. So you can do that math and you can see how many times I've seen different judges and I know what's going to happen, which is why I said depends on the judge, depends on the circumstances. There's certain judges in certain counties that have totally different approaches. So you really got to know all that stuff. And I think it boils down to, from my perspective, I don't believe anything my client says. I start with that premise because they have to prove it. That's what we have to prove to a judge. So I need them to understand that they need to prove it to me because then I'm their mouthpiece so I can prove it to the judge. And you just telling me doesn't make it so. And so I think when we have that conversation, we have to have a candid conversation. We have to be able to go through it and see, what do you need? How are you going to be able to show this? What is the next step? What is the reality of the information or lack thereof that you have or don't have?
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground, and this is a topic that has a lot of ground because you're covering all the different aspects of, the decisions that are made only on a temporary basis and that are most likely going to stay for the interim, unless there's some crazy situation like many of the ones that we brought up today. Is there anything that we have missed, or is there any other information or advice you'd like to give on this topic?
I think the big thing is just that temporary orders are that. They're temporary. They may become the exact same thing at final judgment. They may not. They may expand, they may contract depending on what's going on. And the temporary orders could stay in place for, 2 to 4 years, depending on how long your case is. So it really does set the tone that you want to make sure you have the right attorney by your side from the get go, because all too often I see people that are changing attorneys in between and they're like, but my attorney never told me that I couldn't change this. It makes it a little bit difficult because I'm the bearer of bad news again, and I can only do so much because we didn't have that, that planning session to figure out what we needed to do and how we needed to get there. You didn't divulge this information to your prior attorney because they didn't think it was important, or you didn't have the records then. There's a lot of reasons why it happens, but it's a hard pill to swallow sometimes when you look at that and go, wait a minute, this is going to stay in place for 2 to 4 years, or, depending on how long my case is. Yeah.
Really great topic. I'm so glad that we were able to cover this today, because this really helps the newbies that are just getting into the process, and, just figuring out how to get the ground under their feet with a lot of these issues that they're going to have to deal with and that they need information on. So I want to thank you so much for coming on today and giving us so many great examples and so much great information, on temporary orders, and how they affect your case in the long run.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and thank you so much for watching.